All right, welcome to day 2. Homework you can be putting in your planners is day 2, or you can write packet page 10. We have a warm-up. We are still using the same warm-up sheet because that first week we only had 1 day on it. So put today's warm-up in any blank box. It's okay if it doesn't match on the right day. And we're going to pause the video for maybe 4 minutes for you to make sure you have homework written in your planners, have your homework taken out so you'll be ready to check it when we get there, and to do the warm-up. On the second one, I strongly suggest drawing a picture to help you with that. So again, we'll pause for 4 minutes. So if we had line segments perpendicular, automatically the next thing should be perpendicular lines. Implies right angles. Hopefully that one was an easy one. In the other one, we had 2 triangles. We had triangle BIS, and we've got triangle HOP. B is congruent to H, so we'll mark that up. I is congruent to O, so we'll mark that with a different number of arcs. And IB is congruent to OH. Notice we have a side in between 2 angles, so we should have ASA congruent to ASA. Oops, that should be ASA. For our reason why the triangles would be congruent. All right, so over to your homework. I'm just going to not talk for about 45 seconds and let you check your proof first against what we have here. All right, so we had one given set of things congruent. Midpoint implies 2 congruent segments. That gave us the AD and DB. And then you could do reflexive property to get side, 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 congruent to side, side, side. Now remember, in naming your triangles, we have to be careful now. So I named my first triangle ACD. A was in between my 2 mark and 1 mark sides, so that matches with B in the other triangle. C was in between the 1 mark and the reflexive. That happens to match with C in the other one, and then D. So you have to be careful in naming the triangles now. And then that one extra thing in the triangles we want congruent, that's just because congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts. That was our new step from yesterday. Now, there was one other way we could have done this proof if we wanted. Instead of doing reflexive property here, you could have had 2 additional steps in there. You could have said 2 congruent sides implies isosceles triangle, and said triangle ACB is isosceles. And then you could have done isosceles triangle implies 2 congruent base angles to say angle A and angle B were congruent, and then that would give you side angle side. So this proof did have one alternative way that you could have proved it. This way that I showed was the quickest way, but that other way would be fine as well. Moving over to number 2, again, I'm going to pause for, and not say anything for 45 seconds, just so you can check your proof against this one. So based on perpendicular lines, we should automatically have right angles. Then right angles implies congruent angles. That gave us the angle 1 and angle 2 congruent eventually. Angle bisector, because the angle comes after the word bisects, implies two congruent angles. So I numbered them 3 and 4 in my picture. And then we were out of stuff, so look for a reflexive property. You got angle, side, angle there. And then to get our one extra set of things congruent in the triangles, we needed our congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts. Really, the only thing you could potentially have different in your proof is if you decided to name your angles with 3 letters instead of numbering them. Other than that, pretty much everything should be the same. In your triangle statement here, just make sure Q and R are in the same spot, the P's are in the same spot, and the S's are in the same spot because the corresponding things need to match up. This one's a little shorter, so we're going to give you 30 seconds to look through your proof and compare it. All right, so this one we had some decisions as to which triangles we were trying to get congruent. Eventually we want PS and QR, so we need 2 triangles that have those 2 sides. So it was either these ones here, or you could have done those big ones as well. Those both had PS and QR. Well, to decide between those 2 choices, we want to see, well, in our givens, which triangles is it kind of leading us towards? We got P and Q congruent. That could have been in either set of triangles. But the fact that we've got TS and TR, we want to do these 2 tinier triangles on the left and right. That was already 2 things from the givens. You have crisscrossing lines, so you can do your vertical angles implies congruent angles. Our side is not in between the 2 angles, which is why we had angle, angle, side. I named my first triangle PTS. P was our given angle, that matches with Q in the other one. T was our vertical angle, that matches with T, and then our leftover one is R. And then our new step from yesterday to get that one additional thing congruent in the triangles. Congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts. And we'll give you 45 seconds to check your proof on this one. All right, so notice we have that those bisect each other. So it's going to be segment bisector implies midpoint. And because they bisect each other, this is the one case where it's going to be the midpoint of both things. So A is the midpoint of both HY and EV. So then our midpoint implies 2 congruent segments gets us 2 sets of congruent segments. If our given had just said something like HY bisects EV, then it would have only been the midpoint of EV. But because we bisect each other, that's why we get the midpoint of both. We're out of givens then, and we only had 2 things. Crisscrossing lines to do vertical angles. You have an angle in between 2 sides. When naming your triangles, I chose to call mine EAH. E was in between, which is right here, is in between my 2 mark side and no mark side. So that had to match with V because that was in between the 2 marks and no marks. A was our vertical angle, so that matched with A in the other one, and then Y was our leftover. And then our new step from yesterday, congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts. right, today, our new thing we're going to add on, it's on our green study cards as well, so you can fold the two starred ones are the ones you're going to want to fold back. We're going to look at proofs that have supplementary angles and linear pairs. You could have complementary angle ones as well. Those don't tend to show up as much, so we're going to just focus on the supplementary and the linear pair ones. So on your green card, if you could take that out, find where it says linear pair implies supplementary angles, and see where it says congruent angles implies congruent supplements. Both those are listed with the congruence symbol. And we want to fold those two back because those are additional ones we want to be studying now. So the linear pair was the second one down, and then the congruent angles implies congruent supplements was the fourth one down. So fold those back and be studying those along with your congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts. So if we go down to the bottom, we're going to see our first proof. So we'll give you a minute to do your statements, reasons, and get your givens down. All right, so in our givens, we had some congruent things. Let's mark that in our picture. We've got AP congruent to CP. We'll notice that's a side in the triangles we want congruent, so that's good. And we got angle X congruent to angle Y. Well, why are they possibly giving us angle X congruent to angle Y? They're not in the triangles. Well, this is where our new thing is going to come into play. The angles next to those, I'm going to go ahead and number. I'm going to call them 1 and 2. Angle X and angle Y together make a straight line. Straight line, those angles are linear pairs, which are supplementary. So what we're going to do for our reason, one of our new ones, is we're going to say linear pair implies supplementary angles. And I'm okay if you abbreviate it. Oops, I just need my angles on the end. So linear pair implies supplementary angles. We're pointing at supplementary angles, so in our statement we need to say which angles are supplementary. So we're going to say angle 1 and angle X, comma, angle 2 and angle Y are supplementary. So we just said they're supplementary. Our next reason automatically will be our other new one today. Congruent angles implies congruent supplements. If you're going to abbreviate supplementary angles with SUPP, write out supplements. You wouldn't want to abbreviate that SUPP because that's then meaning something different. Now our statement. Congruent angles means we already had congruent angles. That's our X and Y. This is implying their supplements should be congruent. Well, those are the ones that they're supplementary with. So that means that angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle 2. Now just to talk you through with numbers, imagine angle X and angle Y were 100 degrees. No, actually, let's do X and Y is 80 degrees because they look acute. If x and y were 80 degrees, then 1 and 2 would both be 100 degrees because together the pairs would have to add to 180. And those two steps are our new things for today. Let's go ahead and mark angle 1 and angle 2 congruent in our triangles. Well, we've now used both givens, and we only have two sets of things in our triangles. So we always look out for reflexive and vertical angles. We have reflexive property in this case. And for our statement, we'll just have that BP is congruent to BP. Well, in our triangles, we now have two sides and we have the angle in between. So we can do side angle side congruent to side angle side. And we'll have triangle ABP congruent to triangle CBP because that's what we wanted to prove. So being able to do steps 3 and 4, that's the new stuff for today. All right, let's go over to number 2 on the next page. Take a minute, do your statements, reasons, and get your givens down. All right, we only have one set of things in our givens that are congruent. We have angle CBE and angle DBE. So why would they possibly give us those angles? They're outside the triangle. Well, notice they have ones right next to them that are on a straight line, the 3 and 4 specifically. So that's our new thing for today. So let's go ahead and do that. We've got a linear pair implies supplementary angles. We're pointing at supplementary angles, so we got to say which angles are supplementary. So we can say angle CBE and angle 3 is the one next to it, comma, angle DBE and angle 4 are supplementary. So the one that will always come after that is our other new one today. Our reason will have congruent angles implies congruent supplement. The angles we already knew were congruent were CBE and DBE. So our statement for this should be that the other ones are now congruent. So angle 3 congruent to angle 4. We said it in our proof, so let's make sure to mark it in our picture. Well, our top given we haven't used yet. We've got bisects. Look after the word bisects, you've got an angle. So that tells us we should have angle bisector. Implies two congruent angles. We're pointing at two congruent angles. Angle CAD is the one that was being bisected. So the ones that will be congruent are the two smaller angles there, angle 1 congruent to angle 2. We set it in our proof, so let's make sure we mark it in our picture. We've now got two sets of angles congruent in our triangles. We still need a side that means, and we're out of givens. Hopefully we recognize we're sharing AB, so we can do reflexive property. We'll have AB congruent to AB. We set it in our proof, so we want to make sure we mark it in our picture that something was congruent. Well, now we have two angles with a side in between, so that'll be angle, side angle. And our statement is just what we wanted to prove, our two triangles congruent. Now, these last two, we were just proving the triangle's congruent. You could, with these also, maybe they would want to prove angle C congruent to angle D. Well, that would tell us, oh, okay, I got to get the triangles congruent, and then the step after that, I would do congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts, that new thing that we saw yesterday. We're going to skip question 3, and we're going to finish off this video with proof 4. We'll give you a minute to go ahead, do your statements, reasons, and get down your givens. We have some things that are congruent, so let's mark a bump in our picture. We have angle R congruent to angle S. We have BD congruent to CD. Let's look and see what we want to prove, and we'll come up with a plan. We want to prove that AB is congruent to AC. So we saw in last class, if you've got sides or angles you're looking to get congruent as your proof statement, usually what that means is get the triangles that they are in congruent, and then do congruent triangles implies congruent corresponding parts. So we only have two triangles in this picture, so we want to get those two triangles congruent, and then we'll do that one extra new step that we saw last class. We should be curious by the fact that we are given angle R and angle S, not in the triangles, but notice they're along a straight line. So we can do our new thing for today. Linear pair implies supplementary angles. We're pointing at supplementary angles, so we got to say which pairs are supplementary. To make it easier, let's number them. We may call that 1 and 2. So we can say angle R and angle 1, comma, angle S and angle 2 are supplementary. And again, you can abbreviate it, or if you want to write out the whole word, you can too. That's just your preference. So after that step, we should always do our reason. Congruent angles implies congruent supplements. We already had R and S congruent, so our statement, the ones we still need congruent, would be angle 1 congruent to angle 2. We set it in our proof, so let's make sure we mark it in our picture. Well, we've got a side and an angle. Hopefully you're automatically from that picture thinking in your head, oh, we're sharing a side, so we got reflexive property. And we can do AD congruent to AD. We set it in our proof that they're congruent. Let's make sure we mark it up in our picture. Well, in our triangles, we now have 3 sets of things marked up. We have 2 sides, and we have the angle in between those 2 sides. So that's side angle side. So we have to be a little bit more careful with naming. So we're going to have some triangle congruent to some triangle. We can name the first one whatever we want. So I'm going to call ABD the first one. But now we got to be really careful to match up the second one. A was in between our reflexive side and the side that had no marks. So that matches with A in the other triangle. B was our angle that was between the no marks and the 1 mark. So that matches with C in the other one. And then our last one was D. And then after we get the triangles congruent, we need an extra set of sides or angles congruent. So as we saw in the last class, our new thing, and we'll use this a ton the rest of our proof units, we'll have congruent triangles, implies congruent corresponding parts. We're pointing at congruent corresponding parts. We got to say which corresponding parts we wanted congruent. Well, that's just what we wanted to prove. We wanted to prove that AB was congruent to AC. And that's it. So our new thing again today, if you see that you've got a pair of supplementary angles coming from a linear pair, we do that linear pair implies supplementary angles. State your 2 pairs of supplementary angles like we did in step 4 here. Then always your next reason will be congruent angles implies congruent supplements. And your statement should be the pair of angles that are now inside the triangle being congruent. And then just use your other givens like we've done in our proofs for a while. That's it for this video. Any time left in the period, you can be starting your homework. Have a great rest of your day.